This is part 2 of our section on Judaism. In this lecture, we're going to take a look at Jewish history right up to the Middle Ages, and in the third lecture for the week, we're going to look at the history of Judaism from the Middle Ages up to modern times. So we talked a little bit about biblical history already, and how it all begins with the creation of the world by a single supreme deity or God. It's important to remember that in Judaism, as well as Christianity and Islam, the one God, the singular God, is all-powerful, all-knowing, and has control kind of over everything in one sense or another. A lot of what you see in the Jewish scriptures, the Christian scriptures, the Muslim scriptures, is sort of this trying to work out exactly what God has in mind when things happen, right? So in the Jewish scriptures, you follow the birth of the nation of Israel and their highs and their lows and everything that happens to them. And through it out, you see God's voice, you hear God's voice, you see God's hand guiding things as the Israelites and later the Jews try to interpret what has happened to them and why it's happened. It begins with the patriarchs and the matriarchs, singular people who were not members of any particular religion. Abraham was not an Israelite. Israel did not exist at the time. He was not a Jew, per se. Judaism did not exist. He was a man, and he was a very pious man. And God chose him, picked him out of all the people to be working with, and to teach how to be faithful or how to be loyal to God. It was Moses who spoke with God directly and began receiving God's laws. It's important to remember that, again, that in Judaism and Christianity and Islam, these are religions of laws and rules and writings. And it's always important to know that in each tradition, they have their own set of canon. Canon are the set, fixed scriptures that are accepted to be the true scriptures and exclude all others, right? So Moses was the first prophet who spoke to God and received commandments, received laws. And there are many other prophets besides, though, who heard God, around them, who heard God as a soft voice, as a thundering voice, and were often warned that the Israelites were straying from God's law and would be punished for it, right? So it's these three religions of the book are kind of this back and forth between God trying to set the standards for humanity, and humanity reaching those standards or falling short, and it's this ongoing relationship. And that's one thing that makes Western religion very interesting and very unusual. Keep in mind that, what we're learning in this class is that not all religions are the same. Many people in this class come from a Judeo-Christian background, and so this will seem kind of commonsensical to you. But I encourage you to take these lessons on Judaism and Christianity and juxtapose them against other religions and look at the ways in which, these religions are quite unique, really. And this is one way, this idea of a set relationship between God and humanity as a whole, this back and forth. So we went over the mythical foundations in the last lecture, but just to review, according to the Hebrew scriptures, heaven and earth were created by God in 6 days, starting with light and dark, and then, creating plants and creating insects. And there's this progression of complexities that God has created, and on the final day, God creates people, mankind. We have another important part of Jewish myth is this idea of a covenant, right? That God chose the Israelite people, chose Abraham, Moses, and then God himself directed the foundation of the Israelite people as a chosen people, whereas the rest of humanity had fallen away, right, and were worshiping wrong. A lot of what Western religion comes down to is, are you worshiping right or are you worshiping wrong? It's very important. You know the correct laws to follow and the correct beliefs to believe in, especially once you get into Christianity. That becomes very important. Judaism was an early form of monotheism, one of the earliest. Historians think that the earliest Israelites, the earliest Canaanites, may have called God by a number of names. You find different names in the Hebrew scriptures they call God by. That may be evidence that the early Israelites actually worshipped multiple gods as well, but that one of those gods kind of won out as the patriarch of the gods, as the greatest of all the gods, or perhaps one of these gods became that particular tribe's god. That happened a lot in the ancient Middle East. In the ancient desert, you'd have these nomadic tribes, and they might believe that there might be a multitude of gods, but that tribe had its own god that it focused its worship on. So how exactly that developed or came about, we don't know exactly. It's pretty interesting. On the website, I will put up a link to a PBS video that talks about archaeology in ancient Israel, and it talks a little bit about the question of early monotheism. It is an optional video to watch because it's just quite long. It's like an hour long, but it is really fascinating. It's very well done. It's a Nova presentation. So if you have interest in the ancient Israelites and the way they formed their first tribes, their first cities, I encourage you to take a look at it. Struggle and wandering. These are really important themes that come back again and again. We're going to talk about it in this lecture. We're going to talk about it in the next lecture. How many times in Israelite history and Jewish history were people forced to wander and struggle, and how did they interpret that, especially since the Jewish scriptures tries to understand everything from God's point of view. Israel's birth came from struggle, right? It's a story in which a human being struggles and is finally reborn at a higher level of spirituality. That person was Moses. Moses struggled. He was an Israelite who was living in Egypt at a time when all Israelites were slaves except for him. As a baby, he was found by the Pharaoh's wife, and he was raised as a Pharaoh's brother. And he had to watch his people getting beaten every day. And so the story goes, one day he saw an Egyptian beating an Israelite, and he lost his temper, and he struck the Egyptian and beat him, and the Egyptian died, and Moses had to flee Egypt, right? And he leaves Egypt. He finds a tribe that a small wandering nomadic tribe that takes him in, and he marries one of that tribe's women. And then God comes to him in the form of a burning bush and tells him to return to Egypt and take the Israelites out. So there's this great epic story there of someone who's cast out and someone who doesn't have a place in the world, being challenged to return, to face his fears, to face dangers, and to do what is right. And this has been taken as a metaphor for the spiritual evolution of the people of Israel as a whole. Their wanderings, that they were exiled from Jerusalem time and time again, and they were exiled from a number of different places in the world. They're constantly struggling and wandering, but there's this understanding that they as a people are growing spiritually from their troubles and their trials. Here we have a picture of Moses parting the Red Sea, the famous scene when he takes the Israelites out of Egypt. The Egyptian army is chasing them, and they come to the Red Sea, and God tells Moses to raise up his staff, and when he does, the waters part, and they can walk through safely and get out. And here's a picture of out in the wilderness. They wandered apparently for 40 years. And this is Moses trying to lead them to the promised land. God, through Moses, is leading the Israelite people to a place where they can settle. This is a picture of the actual Mount Sinai. It's an actual mountain in the Middle East. While they were wandering in the wilderness, the Israelites faced a number of trials. They weren't done just because they escaped from Egypt. Trials they faced in the desert were trying to survive, trying to find food, but also trying trying to accept these new laws and commandments that God was sending down. According to legend, Moses went up to the top of Mount Sinai and he spoke to God, and he came back down and his face was glowing because he had been in the presence of the Almighty. So they had to put a veil over his face because he frightened the Israelites. He brought down the 10 Commandments, he brought down a number of commandments, and God instructed the Israelites to build an ark like this, a chest, made of gold with 2 seraphim, which are angels on top, right? And they put the 10 Commandments in it, they put the sacred scriptures in it, and this is important. This becomes a major theme throughout all of Jewish history, the Ark of the Covenant, keeping holy these texts. These texts are something to deserve like their own special chest, and to be honored as if it was a little bit of God among us. And you can see they were carried with them. So for 40 years, the ark was carried with them throughout the wilderness until they came to Jerusalem, and then it was put in the center of the temple. Right, the Ark of the Covenant was the center of the temple, and only the priests were allowed access to it. But they had trouble following the commandments. The major one that the Israelites had trouble with was that they were to have no other God. This is a painting of a famous scene in which the Israelites have grown tired of wandering in the wilderness, and so they found gold and they melted it down and they created a calf, which is a symbol of an ancient Middle Eastern god, Mesopotamian god. I believe it was Baal. That's what that was. The symbol was. Not positive. Point is that they made an idol, a golden idol, and they began worshiping it, hoping that would help their struggles. And Moses had to come to them and chastise them and say, no, you can't do that. We don't do that anymore. We only worship this one God. This one God has no name. It's important. This God has no name and has no image that we could possibly comprehend. So Judaism is a strongly iconoclastic religion. They do not use the images of God. So these symbols, in the form of the 10 Commandments, in the form of the Ark of the Covenant, become symbols of God. Not images of God, but symbols of God, very important ones. So they brought the Ark of the Covenant to Canaan, which at that time belonged to other peoples, and that began many generations of fighting battling in that region. The Israelites believed that they had been given that land by God, and so they had to fight the Canaanites for it, and fight a number of other figures or tribes in the Old Testament. I'm sorry, the Hebrew Scriptures. It's not the Old Testament when you're speaking from a Jewish point of view. It's the Hebrew Scriptures. It began generations of battling for the Promised Land, which, again, in the context of the theme of struggle and wandering, becomes part of the struggle to gain the Promised Land, right? You have to fight for it. It built the first temple. It's also called Solomon's Temple. This is a picture of it. Here, someone has created a model of the ancient city of Jerusalem. I don't know if you can tell this, but this is a miniature for people to visit, give you a sense of what the city might have looked like, and you can see how big the temple grounds were. And people could gather here in the courtyard. No one was allowed inside here. This is where the Holy of Holies was. And that's where the priests would make sacrifices directly to their god. But people would come in and they would bring animals to be sacrificed, and after the meat had been cooked and properly presented, it would be passed out amongst the Israelite people again to consume. You could see it's just a massive, massive temple. And as I mentioned before, it's the only temple. For the Israelites, there was only one temple, so it was extremely holy for them. David, who was the second king of Israel, is remembered as Israel's greatest king. He helped defeat the Philistines, which were another desert tribe, and he helped establish Jerusalem and keep it safe. Under his son, King Solomon, they built the great temple in Jerusalem, which is also called Solomon's Temple. As I mentioned, it's an essential place for sacrifice by the priesthood. For a long time, Judaism had a priesthood. It does not anymore because it does not have temples. the entire purpose, the entire work of the priesthood was to work in the temples and to maintain in the temple and to maintain the temple and perform the sacrifices. In 586 BCE, the great walls of Jerusalem were battered down, the buildings put to torch by the Babylonians, and the Babylonians defiled the temple and destroyed it, and the people of Israel were forced out and began the diaspora, and they had to settle in other parts of Babylonia. It was about this time that the Israelites became known as the Jews, because by that point, the kingdom of Israel had its own internal political problems and had broken into the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. Israel fell before Judah did, about 200 years before Judah did, but eventually Judah fell as well, and the Israelites, no longer having a nation of Israel, became known as Jews. After 50 years of exile, a Babylonian king finally allowed Jewish people to return to Jerusalem. Keep in mind, this entire time, no one was allowed to return to Jerusalem, and therefore no one was allowed to worship in the temple there, in the ruins of the temple. But finally, one of the kings allowed the Jews to return, and they built a second temple. It became kind of this symbol of scattered Jewish nation, right? That they were able to go back and rebuild. But not all of the Jews returned to Jerusalem. It had been, 50 years, which was one or two generations. And a lot of people, didn't want to pick up again. They still honored Jerusalem in their hearts. Oftentimes in that time in diaspora, it was very common for Jews to turn towards Jerusalem 3 times a day and pray, but it was not necessarily financially practical for poor exiled minorities in the Babylonian Empire to up and leave and return to Jerusalem. They just couldn't do it. But the knowledge that the temple existed again and that the priesthood had returned and began doing sacrifices again was of great comfort to the Jewish people. You can see the Wailing Wall. This is all that remains of that temple that was destroyed by the Romans in the 1st century AD. So eventually this one was destroyed as well. So as the Babylonian Empire fell and other empires rose up, the Persians, the Greeks, eventually the Romans, Jewish people had to rethink the way that they did their religion, because most of them weren't in Jerusalem. Most of them couldn't access the temple, and the priesthood was located at the temple, right? That's the only place you need a priesthood is in a temple. So how did Judaism work outside of Jerusalem then? 3 sects appeared by the 1st century CE, or the 1st century AD, as you could say, under the Hasmonean kings, which was a short-lived dynasty of Jewish kings who reclaimed Jerusalem and were eventually occupied by the Romans anyway. For a short time, Jerusalem and Israel had its independence again, or its autonomy. There were three sects, though. There were the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Essenes. You might know these names from the Bible. In the Christian Bible, Jesus argues a lot with the Sadducees and the Pharisees. In real life, what they were the Sadducees were priests and wealthy businessmen. They were kind of the elite of Jewish hierarchy. They were very conservative. They were very intent on preserving the letter of the law, right? The law was still very, very important. That's one way Jewish people continued to practice their religion without being able to go to the temple, was to follow the law in their lives. Then there are the Pharisees, who are actually, despite the way they're painted in the New Testament, the Pharisees were actually fairly liberal citizens. They came from all classes. They were very educated Jewish men who sought to study the applications of the Torah to everyday life. The Pharisees recognized that there were a lot of Jewish people living in Greece, in Rome, in Syria, and that they were slowly adapting to Syrian culture, Greek culture, Roman culture, and that there needed to be some practical solutions to everyday problems. How do you keep kosher? How do you keep a kosher diet? Right? So Jewish people need to prepare their food in a very certain way to keep it pure. That's called kosher. How do you prepare kosher when you're living in a foreign nation where they might not, have what you need to keep kosher? How do you do business with foreigners, or Gentiles as they're called, with Gentiles who don't follow the laws of the Hebrew scriptures, right? How do you do business with them? How do you live under Roman rule, when the Romans required all citizens to do two things to be for citizenship: pay their taxes and sacrifice to the god Jupiter. That was national duty. Just like nowadays, you have to pay your taxes if you're a U.S. citizen. In ancient times, you had to pay your taxes, but you also had to sacrifice to the national god to keep your nation safe. That was very normal. It was that way in every nation throughout the Mediterranean. So how do the Jews live under that, when they can't sacrifice to anyone but their own god? So the Pharisees were the precursors to the rabbis. Eventually, we'll talk about how Judaism turned into Rabbinic Judaism. Judaism was based around rabbis who were teachers who teach the Torah and teach the Tanakh. And all started with the Pharisees, who were trying to deal with these practical problems that Jews were dealing with in the diaspora. That's who the Pharisees were. Then there is the Essenes. It was a small group, but a significant group, who had been perhaps influenced by Zoroastrian or other Eastern philosophies that believed that the world was divided very strictly between the good and the evil, and that you had to separate yourself out from the evil, secular, material world and focus on purifying yourself. And there were multiple Essene, I guess you could say, villages or communes throughout what was Palestine. And they were disgusted with how the other Jewish people in the diaspora had adapted to other cultures as they had moved to other places, and they felt that the priesthood was corrupt, that they were living under Roman rule, it wasn't fair, and so they were very zealous and very, I want to say extreme, but they were very passionate believers, and they believed very strongly that a Messiah was coming, and that a Messiah was going to save the Jewish people from occupation, and there was going to be a great war, and the enemies of Israel were going to suffer, and we're going to, feel God's wrath. It's interesting because these themes eventually died out in Judaism. The Essenes died out very quickly because they gained the wrath or the anger of the Roman authorities, but some of these themes made their way into a very small Jewish group in the 1st century A.D. Who followed a man named Jesus of Nazareth, right? This idea of the world being divided between good and evil, and that there might be eventually like a great battle that would end the war. That was one of the stepping stones to those themes making their way into Jewish religion and then eventually into Christianity. So the Essenes are worth mentioning, even though they played a relatively small part in that time period. So, the Sadducees were priests, the Pharisees who were teachers and students and scholars, and the Essenes. We have pictures of Sadducees and Pharisees sitting around. You can see this man has a Torah here, and they're, discussing important legal and philosophical matters, and that becomes the heart of Judaism. Once the Second Temple falls, all they really have is the law and the stories, and it becomes extremely important. And learning the stories and learning the law and discussing it and trying to interpret it becomes a central part of worship in Judaism. So I want to talk a little bit about synagogues. Since there was only one temple and few people had access to it, unless you're living in Jerusalem, Jewish people began using synagogues synagogue was a really common Greek institution. Synagogue literally just means meeting place, or a place to come together. That's what synagogue means. And so Jewish people began using synagogues as a place to gather and to read the Torah and things like that. And over time, these very simple meeting places became increasingly religious in the way they were designed, in the way in the ways that Jewish people used them. This is a famous synagogue in Dur Europos, which is in Syria. What's interesting about this synagogue is that it comes from about the first 3 centuries AD. It was in use. It was originally a house of a very rich person, because it was a large house, and a house most likely of a Jewish person who donated the house to the Jewish community in this small town. And this actually is a pretty big town in Syria, in this town called Dur Europos, right? So there's a Jewish community, clearly a fairly rich Jewish community living in Dur Europos. One of the members donates his house, and they go through and they renovate it to make it more useful for the community. So the eating place becomes a house of assembly. They put this little nook in here. This is really interesting, because this archway, this is a Greek and Roman religious thing. Every Greek and Roman temple would have a little arch like this, and in the arch they would put an idol. They'd put a statue of the god of that temple, or sometimes they'd have multiple statues, right? But the Jewish people can't put up an image of their god. What they can do is they can paint these gorgeous murals with pictures from famous stories from the Bible. And in this little niche here, they put a copy of the Torah. And this becomes kind of the Holy of Holies, right? You remember the center of the temple? There's the Holy of Holies that holds the Ark of the Covenant. This becomes kind of not a version of it, because it's not a temple. You can't have a Holy of Holies outside of the temple. But it's an homage. It's a reminder to the Jewish people of the Holy of Holies, and they keep the Torah there. And this becomes a really important part of Jewish worship, as we're going to see. That there's a special place where they keep the Torah, that they have it on these sticks so they can unroll it. You're not allowed to touch the parchment, or you're not allowed to touch the paper. So they cover it in these beautiful coverings that have a symbol of the crown, which does not represent God. It represents the authority of the law. The authority of the law is represented by a crown. Also, pictures of the 10 Commandments on the outside, on the cover of the Torah. So you can see these beautiful murals they've put up. This is Pharaoh's daughter finding Moses in the river. This is from the story of Esther, a Jewish woman who was the wife of a Babylonian king and used her influence with the Babylonian king to keep the Jewish people safe from persecution at that time. And there you can see there's just any number of pictures. It still exists. It was actually, the town was abandoned and covered in sand for 2,000 years. It was found in the early 20th century. And the Syrian government took great pains to preserve it. And these are actually the original walls that were very, very carefully taken from Dur Europos, from the archaeological site, and put in a museum. And they're so delicate that people even aren't allowed to see them. We have pictures of them, but people aren't allowed to go in and see them because they're trying to maintain them. But this is how, the point of this is that this is how the tradition of the synagogue began, right? It was a meeting place, and then communities started putting money together to decorate them and to make them more kind of respectable and proper. And they found a place for the Torah, and over time they built up an institution of the synagogue. But really, originally the synagogue was just a meeting place. So the Jewish people formed several revolts throughout their time of occupation. They had several revolts against the Romans. One in 66 CE, and it went on. It petered on for 4 years, and in 70 CE, Jewish people were just slaughtered in Jerusalem, and the Romans brought in a statue of Jupiter and put it within the temple, and they erased the temple, and they kicked out the Jewish people, and they renamed Jerusalem after Jupiter. It was like the final humiliation was to kick the Jewish people out and rename the city of Jerusalem after Jupiter. And this was the last time that the Jewish people would be in Jerusalem or be allowed to return to Israel for about 2,000 years. There was another disastrous revolt in 132 CE, and eventually Judea, because at that time the Roman province of Israel was called Judea. It was renamed Palestine after the ancient Philistines. And for the next 2,000 years, Judaism had no physical heart or geographic center. It was a very dramatic ending to a very long and difficult history in that region. So they go back to struggling and wandering, right? This is where their adaptability, mentioned in the last lecture, the Jewish are really adaptable, and that's when this becomes really important, because they have to learn to live in other cultures while maintaining their own culture. After that time, the Pharisees, the authority of the Pharisees came together. The Sadducees were gone because the Sadducees were priests and they didn't have a temple anymore. So the Pharisees became the main authority, and they spent some time putting together a canon of Jewish scripture, which is called the Tanakh. Not only that, they put together a compendium of Jewish law and lore called the Talmud, which is not necessarily divinely inspired, but is based upon oral history, is based upon tradition, is based upon great Jewish leaders and philosophers. And the Talmud is also very sacred to the Jewish people, but it's not as sacred as the Tanakh. The Tanakh is the scriptures handed down, through the prophets. The Talmud is commentary on the scriptures. It's the study guide to the scriptures, but it's still considered very important. And thus begins this long tradition of holy men who focus their time on study, right? Studying the books. That becomes what Jewish holy men do. And again, kind of the genius or the practicality of the Torah, the scroll, is that it becomes mobile, right? As the Jewish people need to pick up and leave time and time again, they can't bring the temple with, but they can bring the stories of the temple with. They can bring the stories of the priesthood, the stories of the great kings with them, wherever they go. And that is the significance of the scriptures to the Jewish people. So no matter where they went, they could bring this with them. So after the fall of the temple and the Pharisees kind of became the main authority that was left, and the Essenes were long gone, thus developed Rabbinic Judaism. The word rabbi means teacher in Hebrew. So it became Rabbinic Judaism is Judaism that is led by the teachers. A messianic movement did survive the destruction of Judea, however, and even until today, many Jews believe that a Messiah may someday return and save Israel from its enemies that still exists. So what rabbis do, they teach, they make decisions, they create liturgical prayer. Liturgical means ritual, the ritual rules that everyone follows. They interpret Hebrew scriptures. The interesting thing about Judaism, though, is that when people interpret the Hebrew scriptures, they're very accepting of disagreement amongst the rabbinical community, amongst the rabbis. Not everyone agrees on how to interpret Hebrew scriptures. Whereas if you're from a Christian background, you might know that if you're part of a certain denomination, if you're Baptist, if you're United Methodist, if you're a Roman Catholic, your denomination has a set interpretation of much of the scriptures, right? You turn to your priest, you turn to your pastor to tell you how to interpret it. In Judaism, they really encourage disagreement and debate. It's it's an important part of what Rabbinic Judaism is. They encourage thinking and interpreting and debating and disagreeing, and that is why there are actually two different Talmuds. Commentaries on the scriptures, and they're both really important. And rabbis not only follow those interpretations, they debate the interpretations as well and say, well, what does this interpretation really mean? What does this commentary really mean? So the Jewish people try really hard to apply these biblical teachings to their contemporary lives, even though cultural circumstances are extremely different today than they were in ancient times. And there's also modern Judaism has struggles to try and interpret Scripture in ways that are acceptable to contemporary values. We'll get to talk about that more in the next lecture. And we have to mention that there was this little Jewish offshoot movement led by a Jewish man named Jesus of Nazareth, who was perhaps a rabbi himself, or maybe just an itinerant, philosopher. Maybe he had some sort of connection to the Essene movement. We don't know. But eventually, the Jewish Christians, as the early cult is called, became more and more Christian and less Jewish, and eventually it became its own religion. But the Messianic movement, it did have some. The Messianic movement of Jesus of Nazareth did have some connections to that early rabbinic movement. There was a connection there. Okay, so discussion for part 2. What changes do you see happening to the Jewish people over the years? What changes do you see happening? Every religion changes. Every religion has to change as circumstances around it change. And I admit that we just plowed through like 3,000 years of history. And there were a lot of changes that took place. But from your perspective, having read the textbook, having listened to the lecture, what changes do you see happening to the Jewish people over time? Okay? That's part 2.